Coming up, the colonial dames of America, Lafayette the Negotiator, and the Battle of Newport. Welcome to Living Lafayette for the Lafayette Alliance here in LaGrange, Georgia. I'm Richard Ingram. There's Tony Privatera right there. He's the engineer, and when you see this podcast, he takes care of the editing and the graphics. He does a stunning job. I reviewed the first episode we did. It's coming up on 3 years ago, and I'm impressed with the job Tony does with what he has to work with. He does a great job. You need to go back. You can get on YouTube and you can see all the episodes that we had. Let's take care of some odds and ends just a little bit. First of all, Lafayette was always concerned with ethics and ethical behavior, and some people said he was naive on that account. But it was interesting that I recently saw a poll of professions that Americans consider the most ethical, and it was just interesting to me. So when I looked at that poll, the top 4 most ethical professions seen by Americans. And if we start at number 4, so down at the bottom, the 4th, physicians. Listen, those folks are my own kind, of course, but we ought to be embarrassed by that placement. We were much better than that. There are certainly reasons for that, and it's horse out of the barn, perhaps, but they're 4th from the top. 3rd are engineers. 2nd, veterinarians, and here is the most admired profession as seen by Americans: nurses. Now, and it's interesting also to look at the bottom 4. So journalists, lawyers, business people, and then at the bottom of the pile, Congress. That's sort of interesting to me. So congressmen ought to be statesmen, and yet they don't have that reputation at all. It's not like they're in civil debate, and apparently those on the extremes, they really color the entire cohort. I do agree. Nurses rule the world. Case closed, hands down. And I think the reason for that is nurses pay attention. Nurses take time. They have your best interest at heart. I agree. Nurses, they pay attention to what the issue is. 2nd, I've been reading David Goggins' book, Can't Hurt Me. Goggins is a motivational speaker. He was in the military. His story is triumph over adversity, and it's a compelling, inspiring story. And there's a common mold of these stories. So several people over the years have been motivational speakers. The one I most remember is Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. But more currently, Tony Robbins, Awaken the Power Within. Zig Ziglar, my dad, who is 96 years old, he's a World War II man. He really enjoyed Zig Ziglar. He gave me a copy of Zig Ziglar's book, See You at the Top. He was a salesman, and his story was compelling. There was Napoleon Hill, you may recall, Think and Grow Rich, and then more currently, Robert Greene, Mastery and Concise 48 Laws of Power. It's a little bit more Machiavellian. It struck me, reading Goggins' book, that Lafayette, he's a motivational speaker. His story is motivational. It's triumph over adversity. And then I began to wonder, how would Lafayette do a motivational talk? How would he go about it? Here's how I think he would do it. At the appointed time, I think Lafayette would walk center stage. There would be no kettle drum rolls. There would be no trumpets. That he would just be plain and matter of fact. And then I think he would say this: it's your life. Own it. The world owes you nothing. Let go regret. Let go resentment. When you were little, you were awkward. You were ugly. They bullied you. They made fun. That's all part of the deal. Let it go. Those people didn't know any better, or they didn't care. You have a choice: wallow in misery or summon the will to get out. Then work to make it happen. It is not about what was. It's about what can be. It is not about who you are. It's about who you want to be. I think Lafayette would have been a great motivational speaker. Third, I recently had occasion to talk with the Georgia contingent, the Georgia Society of the Colonial Dames of America, 17th century. You remember that 17th century part? That's a little confusing. So the 17th century name is 1 point ahead of the numeric. 17th century recalls the 1600s. So these are ladies who have their origins, their ancestry, that dates back before 1701 and rooted here in Georgia. So they've got a long thread. And of course, we talked about Lafayette, but I also tried to make 3 points, tried to make an argument. First, the idea of America, and that's a phrase coined by Gordon Wood, professor of history. But the idea of America, despite all the recent trashing, which typically is extremist in nature and tries to shadow the whole of our history, and it tends to be histrionic hyperbole. But the idea of America was and still is a good one. Mortimer Adler, who is professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago, says that we have come up with really, when you distill them, 102 great ideas. Of those, 6 are really superlative. The 3 great ideas we act on, liberty, equality, and justice, are framed by the 3 great ideas we judge by: truth, goodness, and beauty. Here's what's stunning. America was the first nation ever to set as its purpose achieving liberty, equality, and justice. The first time you put in bold print, all men are created equal, it sets a trajectory. You can argue about policy, you can argue about execution, you can argue about effectiveness, but you have set the standard. And it's a process. And everybody has to work on the process. But in order to work through the process, everybody has to be on the same page. They have to be grounded in the beginning, which means they need to know history in order to work through the process, in order to be on the same page. Second part of this argument, we cannot appreciate what we have until we understand what it took to get it. When you understand that history, you see things differently. You do things differently. You vote differently, in fact. For everybody to be grounded and be on the same page in working toward this democratic ideal of liberty, equality, and justice, and to be on the same page, we have to know history. When you see Gary Cooper walk down Main Street in high noon with a determined eye, you don't know why unless you know the history, unless you know Frank Miller's in town. He just got out of prison. He's gunning. When you see one of the iconic films in all of American filmdom, Casablanca, and you see at the end, there's Ingrid Bergman, and she's being told by her now favorite, that Humphrey Bogart, that where I'm going, you can't follow.
No. He's looking at you, kid.
You don't know what that means unless you know the history, unless you know about Paris, unless you know about sacrifice. My friend Lanny, back in high school, he asked Cindy for a date. He didn't get the history. Cindy already had a boyfriend, 6 feet tall, 200 pounds, and jealous. Lanny had the black eye to prove it. You got to know the history. Third, here's the big deal. Lafayette is a means of learning history painlessly. We want no part of learning history if it hurts to learn it. So if you take Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z, and now Alphas, and you tell them you can learn history, but you have to have a root canal to do it, we're doomed. And for those folks, Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z, and Alphas, sitting down and listening to a lecture is the equivalent of a root canal. So how we tell history's story makes a difference. Jean Twenge is a professor at San Diego State University, and she wrote a wonderful book last year called Generations. And she talks about perspectives of these generations of Gen X and Millennials and Gen Z and Alphas. They are visual. To sit down and listen to that, to listen to a lecture for them is the equivalent of a root canal. Will not capture their interest. Lafayette's story can be staged. It can be told in dramatic fashion that captures their interest, and it has to be done in short snippets. But this is one way of getting history across, of getting people to understand our common past. And keep in mind, when you talk about history, you're also talking about philosophy writ large. Will Durant wrote about this, that history is the best lesson in philosophy. All right, there was my story. There are the odds and ends. Let's get back to Lafayette's. The Battle of Monmouth, you recall, has been done. So Lieutenant General Clinton has evacuated the field of Monmouth, which means that Washington and the Continental Army claimed the ground. So technically, they won. Well, really, it was sort of a standoff. In any event, Washington took his army, the Continental Army, now across the Hudson, and he camped at King's Ferry in New York. Washington, that is Lafayette, led the second contingent behind Washington and crossed the Hudson, and 4 days later set in at White Plains, New York. Lafayette there had time on his hands. They were just watching, the Continental Army was watching Clinton and his folks up at New York. So Lafayette wrote letters, lots of letters. When Lafayette had time on his hands, he wrote. And the letters he wrote were to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, to Henry Lawrence, who was president of the Continental Congress. And he wrote recommending his fellow Frenchmen for commissions as officers in the Continental Army. And Lafayette wrote a lot of these letters, so many that Henry Lawrence wrote Lafayette to ask Lafayette to give him a break. He was getting so many of these letters, and Lafayette wrote Lawrence back, and Lafayette was self-deprecating. He said he understood that it was onerous, that it was burdensome. But these were fellow Frenchmen. It was like a fraternity. He felt an obligation to stand up for them, to recommend them for commissions. And it was interesting that he wrote this capitulatory letter, but then at the bottom, he also asked for some of his friends for them to be given commissions. Henry Lawrence appreciated that in Lafayette. It's also interesting that today many times with social media we're passive aggressive. So we make comments or we make criticisms and we sort of pitch them out there so we don't have to do anything face to face. Lafayette was not of that ilk. If he had a criticism, he had an objection, it was face to face. It was not an in-round run. Washington, for his part, said that he wished they only had one Frenchman in the Continental Army, and that Lafayette, because Lafayette operated from principles cut above. There was big news on July 5th. A French naval squadron was seen off the coast of Maryland. This was a big deal. So the Treaty of Alliance had been signed back on February the 6th, 1778. 2 days later, preparations were being made at Toulon, which was the port down on the Mediterranean, southern France. 12 ships of the line, 12 big battleships, and 4 frigates were made ready to make the trip to America to support Americans in their fight against the British. The leader of this squadron was Lieutenant General. He was really an army man, but he was placed in charge of this naval squadron, and Vice Admiral Comte d'Estaing. D'Estaing was from the Auvergne, which is where Lafayette was from, and in fact they were distant cousins. So d'Estaing had brought his fleet up to the coast of Maryland, and there he deposited, on their way to Philadelphia, he deposited Silas Deane. You remember Silas Deane was the first spy, really, sent by the Continental Congress to Paris to try to foment support and to drum up financial support from France. Deane had been recalled by the Continental Congress because he had overstepped his authority, and he had commissioned so many French officers in the Continental Army. So he was now going to be drilled on why he took that move. Also aboard in this squadron was Conrad Alexander Girard, who was the ambassador from France to the United States and highly thought of. They were deposited there in Maryland, then they would make their way to Philadelphia. And d'Estaing and his squadron was on the way to New York. They anticipated they would attack the British, whose main camp was there in New York. As soon as d'Estaing arrived along the coast of Maryland en route to New York, Lafayette wrote a letter welcoming d'Estaing. Washington likewise wrote a letter, and the letters were carried to D'Estaing by John Lawrence. That was Henry Lawrence's son, Lieutenant Colonel. John Lawrence spoke fluent French. Lafayette signed his letter, interestingly, the only way he ever signed it, in this instance, Gilbert de Mortier, Monsieur de Lafayette. So his letter to Comte d'Estaing he signed in this fashion, the only letter he ever signed that way. And the reason he signed it that way is because d'Estaing would realize this letter was authentic, because d'Estaing knew that Gilbert de Mortier was Lafayette's given name. After that, it's interesting that Lafayette began signing his name just Lafayette, plain Lafayette. And Louis Gottschalk says that the first time he wrote a letter with that signature alone was September the 1st, 1778, and he wrote it to Alexander Hamilton. D'Estaing arrived up at New York, there at Sandy Hook, right in the harbor of New York, and discovered that they couldn't attack New York. And the reason they couldn't is because the French fleet, the ships took on too much water. They'd run aground on the shoals there in New York Harbor. Done deal. They'd come this far, and now they couldn't attack New York. The Continental Congress and Washington and d'Estaing decided on an alternative target, Newport, Rhode Island. Back in December of 1776, Lieutenant General Henry Clinton and Brigadier General Robert Prescott, they had attacked Newport and captured it with redcoats and with Hessians. So they had held Newport ever since 1776. Now, this Prescott was the same one who had been in a prisoner exchange for Charles Lee back earlier in 1778, you recall. So now, and I think I've said Robert Prescott, it's Richard Prescott, but now there were some 6,000 redcoats there at Newport under General Robert Pickett. And watching them across from the islands on the mainlands at Providence, Rhode Island, was General John Sullivan and some 3,000 Continentals. The geography here is important. So on the one hand, you have New York, and if you go across the Atlantic, there's Point Judith still in the Atlantic, and here's the mainland, and then there's Cononicut Island right here, and then there is Aquidneck Island, the original name for Rhode Island. And it's an island surrounded by water. There's Narragansett Bay, and then there's Newport Harbor, and then up across the water, up north, there is Providence, Bristol, Tiverton, and then on the island itself, there's Butts Hill, which is up in the north, then Turkey Hill, which is in the west, and then Quaker Hill, which is over in the east, and then Newport down south. So Aquidneck Island is the original name of what is now Rhode Island, and it was an island specifically. So the geography becomes important here. Washington put Lafayette in charge of General Varnum's 4 regiments, General Glover's brigade, and Colonel Jackson's regiments, and told Lafayette to carry those troops up to Providence, Rhode Island. So 2,000 men, 200 miles over 13 days. And when they arrived, Washington split those men, half of them be under Lafayette and then half under Major General Nathaniel Greene. And at Providence, when they arrived, the community celebrated their arrival. Lafayette stayed at the home of the governor, Governor Bowen, and at his mansion. Major General John Sullivan was overall in charge, and he asked Lafayette to be his personal emissary to talk with Comte d'Estaing to get their plans down. On August the 4th, 1778, Lafayette boarded the Languedoc, which was Comte d'Estaing's flagship. And he and d'Estaing talked about strategies. And they decided that the best maneuver would be a pincer maneuver, where the Continental Army attacked Newport from the north, and d'Estaing and his men attacked from the south, and they just put the squeeze on them. Lafayette and d'Estaing also thought it'd be a great idea if John Sullivan would permit 1,500 elites from the Continental Army to come down south and join a French contingent, which Lafayette would lead. This would be a joint Franco-American expedition to attack the British, and Lafayette would lead it. Lafayette had always had this in mind. This was one of his dreams. It was on a pedestal, and now the dream was coming true. He would lead this joint Franco-American force. So Lafayette carried this idea back to Major General Sullivan and Major General Greene. Lafayette was excited about this. Greene and Sullivan, not so much. They didn't see that it'd work well to take 1,500 elite Continentals and send them down to fight with the French in the South when they needed to take care of things in the North. It just didn't sit well with them. Lafayette was really disappointed. Lafayette encouraged d'Estaing to continue to lobby Sullivan to agree to this design. And d'Estaing, for his part, was concerned that Sullivan might take things out on Lafayette because Lafayette could be enthusiastic whenever he took an idea under his umbrella. D'Estaing wrote Sullivan to tell Sullivan that this whole idea was d'Estaing's, and not to take things out on Lafayette. And d'Estaing also encouraged Lafayette to do what Sullivan wants to do. So D'Estaing was very tactful and very diplomatic. And as a consequence of that, Sullivan did agree. Let's take a contingent of 1,000, less than Lafayette had hoped for, but a contingent of 1,000, and it can be this Franco-American contingent that you'd like to put together. D'Estaing landed his men on Connecticut Island. So right across Narragansett Bay was Newport Harbor and Newport. But he landed his troops on Sunday, August the 8th, for maneuvers there on Connecticut Island. And that same day, some of the French ships went into Newport Harbor. General Piggott assumed that this was a prelude to attack. He scuttled some of the British ships that were out in Newport Harbor so that they wouldn't be captured. And up at Butts Hill, up north of the islands of Aquidneck, now Rhode Island, he recalled his troops who were on that high ground. So they came back to Newport. They abandoned that high ground in Butts Hill. Well, on August the 9th, so the following day, there were some 9,000 troops now on Connecticut Island that D'Estaing had unloaded there. That same day, Major General John Sullivan, he became aware that Piggott had recalled his troops from the high ground Butts Hill. So, D'Estaing and Sullivan had agreed that they were both going to land on Rhode Island at the same time, same day. That would be August the 10th. And this was a matter of honor. We can argue that that might be adolescent, that it might be, but they had agreed. August the 10th, both forces, Continental Army and French, were going to land on August the 10th, same day. Well, when Sullivan found out that the British had abandoned Butts Hill, it was an opportunity. He crossed his men over onto the island to take Butts Hill, the high ground. D'Estaing found out about that and was ticked about it. They had made an agreement August the 10th, and here Sullivan had crossed on August the 9th. It was not part of their agreement. Later, Comte d'Estaing said, yes, it was the right thing for Sullivan to do, but still at the time, he was irritated about it. It was a point of honor. At this time, back in New York, Admiral Richard Howe dispatched ships to Rhode Island in support of General Piggott. Those ships arrived off Point Judith, which was out in the Atlantic, not far from Rhode Island. They arrived on August the 9th. Well, Comte d'Estaing saw those ships arriving, and he took off, put his fleet together, and took off after those ships on August the 10th. He was going to do battle, face to face. As fate would have it, a huge Atlantic storm brewed up and just battered both fleets, the British and the French, just tore them up. So d'Estaing limped back to Newport on August the 20th, his ships in poor repair, and he told Sullivan that he needed to go back to Boston. On the next day, August 21st, Lafayette and Nathaniel Greene went to Comte d'Estaing to argue that he should attack, that now was the time. Well, d'Estaing was a military man, and he tended to want to attack, but he deferred to his junior officers, who were Navy men. And the junior officers said nothing doing, that we've got to get repairs. Sullivan argued, well, you can be repaired up at Providence, Rhode Island. We can do it here. You don't have to go to Boston. The junior officers said, we need really the expertise of Boston. That was on the 21st. On the 22nd, d'Estaing said, we need to go to Boston. That's what my men say. So they headed off to Boston. Sullivan was not tactful or diplomatic. This really irritated him that d'Estaing would sail off. And he sat down and wrote a 9-point letter just outlining what D'Estaing had done, effectively accusing D'Estaing of cowardice. And Sullivan asked all his officers to sign this letter. Lafayette was incensed. D'Estaing was no coward, and D'Estaing was also a relative and from the Auvergne. Lafayette just would not sign this letter, was not going to do it. This was one of the first major breaches that Lafayette had with the Continental Army and with John Sullivan. And then Sullivan on the 24th, in his orders of the day, repeated his accusation, effectively calling D'Estaing a coward. Lafayette had enough. He went straight to Sullivan and had it out with Sullivan. Comte D'Estaing is not a coward, and they got it all on the table. Sullivan admitted he had been rash, he had shot from the hip, that's not what he meant. And they got that taken care of. But Lafayette went directly to the source to try to get things rectified. In any event, that letter, 9-point letter, had already been sent to Major Heath there at Boston to be given to D'Estaing. Lafayette still had to vent, so he wrote letters to the president of the Continental Congress, who was his friend Henry Lawrence, to his best friend, George Washington, and his next best friend, Alexander Hamilton. On August 27th, two things happened. First, Americans had moved within 2 miles. The Continental Army had moved within 2 miles from Butts Hill down within 2 miles of Newport. They now gave up that siege, and they divided forces. Over on the west, Major General Nathaniel Greene was at Turkey Hill, and his advanced guard was the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. This is a big deal. The 1st Rhode Island was formed back in 1775 by the Rhode Island legislature. That same year, the Continental Congress incorporated the 1st Rhode Island into the Continental Army. It was under the command of General James Mitchell Varnum. It was known as Varnum's Regiment. In 1777, Varnum was promoted to brigadier general, and so the 1st Rhode Island was now under the command of Colonel Christopher Greene, who was a distant cousin to Nathaniel Greene. And then in early 1778, the Rhode Island Regiment agreed that the 1st Rhode Island could recruit blacks and Native Americans into this 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which it did. So this was the regiment. It became known as the Black Regiment. And it was the one that was the vanguard there with Nathaniel Greene at Turkey Hill. Over on the east, Brigadier General John Glover protected Quaker Hill. So there was Turkey Hill on the west and Quaker Hill on the east. Major General Nathaniel Greene, Brigadier General John Glover. Robert Pickett sent 2 separate forces to intercept the 2 divisions of the Continental Army. So one was a Hessian commander, Lossberg, and the other Major General Francis Smith to oppose Glover. The second thing that happened on the 27th is Sullivan asked Lafayette to ride to Boston and to convince D'Estaing to come back. Lafayette rode 70 miles over 7 hours and arrived about the same time that Comte D'Estaing arrived. But D'Estaing had already been given that letter that Sullivan had written, the 9-point letter, effectively accusing him of being a coward. And so D'Estaing was not in a great mood. Lafayette was the diplomat. He was the negotiator. He got things calmed down. Eventually, D'Estaing said, fine, I'll serve under Sullivan, which was really a capitulation. I mean, it was magnanimous is what it was. But D'Estaing said, I'll serve under Sullivan, whatever we need to do to make this work. The following day, Lafayette and D'Estaing both went to dinner with John Hancock, who was a major general over Massachusetts militia and had been up at Newport, in fact, up at Rhode Island. but had traveled back to Boston. They had dinner with him, and in Hancock's home, there was apparently a spectacular portrait of Washington, and Lafayette was really taken by it. And Lafayette asked Hancock if he had a copy and if Lafayette could have it. Hancock did have a copy, but he elected to give that copy to D'Estaing. Lafayette said that D'Estaing was just overwhelmed by it, really appreciated it, so much so that D'Estaing wanted his men to salute that painting as it came aboard his flagship, the Languedoc, until his men convinced him that protocol, which held high esteem in France, that protocol would not admit that. Lafayette was anxious. He was concerned that he would miss out on the battle going on in Rhode Island. On August the 29th, Major General Francis Smith attacked Glover on the east. That was repelled. Likewise, over at Turkey Hill, Nathaniel Greene was attacked by Lossberg. 3 separate attacks repulsed. Greene held his ground. Sullivan decided after those attacks to regroup his men up at Butts Hill, the high ground. Pickett made one last attack on Butts Hill. It was repulsed. The Battle of Rhode Island, over on August the 29th. The next day, August the 30th, Sullivan decided to take his men off the island and get them back to the mainland, over at Tiverton and Bristol. So they evacuated. Lafayette, still back in Boston, was concerned that he was going to miss out on everything, and he hauled off from Boston and rode 7.5 hours, headwinds coming back, 7.5 hours, arrived back at Rhode Island at 11 p.m. He took charge of the retreat, which was still going on, and Sullivan complimented Lafayette on how organized the retreat was. All the men were back on the mainland and off Rhode Island by 2 a.m. It was August 31st. By dawn the next morning, over the horizon were 100 British ships carrying 5,000 men. Had Sullivan kept his men on Rhode Island, it likely would have ended the Revolutionary War. The Continental Army would have been captured and sequestered on that island. This is one of those events that gets a little attention. Contingency is the hinge of history. Things didn't have to work out the way they did. The Continental Army could have been captured there, but for the fact that Sullivan decided to evacuate his men from the island onto the mainland, and that Lafayette made it go smoothly. Washington wrote Lafayette on September the 1st, asking him to be sure that Comte d'Estaing was comfortable, that things were calm, and that d'Estaing was mollified after getting Sullivan's letter. Lafayette wrote a letter to d'Estaing on September the 5th, trying to be sure that was the case, and also asked d'Estaing to smooth Lafayette's way back into the royal court. You remember when Lafayette left, the king had told him, no, you can't go. So Lafayette was under somewhat of a cloud back home. Lafayette at this time also made his first comment about how efficient republics were in mobilizing for war. And he said that efficiency was lacking when the republic tried to mobilize. Lafayette was learning. This is Living Lafayette. Discover, inform, entertain. Till next time.